Bill was on his way home. He began his trip by walking, but ended up just taking a flight instead. Except this flight wasn't by choice, and it for sure wasn't by a plane. And when the tentacles unfolded from out of this thing's teeth-lined beak, Bill quickly realized that catching a ride from a real-life Eldritch horror was a one-way ticket. Oh, and this tale is far from the most wild and terrifying story we're about to trudge up. But before we begin, if you love cryptids and want to learn the full story, both the legends and the facts, delivered as a narrative story, then this guided tour is for you. Glide on over and tap that subscribe, like, or review button, depending on where you watch or listen. Now, dust off your Lovecraftian literature and get ready. The tour is about to start. I'm Cody, and you're touring Cryptids across the Atlas. The term Eldritch horror has seen a lot of popularity in the darker corners of the internet. Games like Elden Ring, voted Game of the Year in 2022, heavily lean on these themes in both style and writing. Monstrous beings like Cthulhu have cemented themselves in popular culture, going as far as to inspire a pseudo-religion even, called Pastafarianism, where acolytes worship the flying spaghetti monster, or Cthulhu in disguise. With all the modern attention, it's easy for the Lovecraftian style to feel fresh and new, but H.P. Lovecraft cooked up this tangled mess of monsterdom back in 1917 with his published short story, Dagon. Now, to be frank, Lovecraft wasn't exactly as popular back then as his works are now. Sci-fi horror was a redundant mix of silly tropes and rehashed echoes of the same old stories back then. We still love a good rendition of Frankenstein's monster, whether it be Guillermo del Toro's upcoming take due out in 2025, or even the version produced by Edison Films way back in 1910. And yeah, I am referring to Thomas Edison there. But when Lovecraft came on the scene, his take on horror was significantly different. His themes played more on the idea of space and time, and that the Earth is but a speck in the infinite universe and we're just ants crawling about, playthings to beings that lord over us as if we were next to nothing. We're less than pawns in a bigger game than life itself. But what if the founder of cosmic horror wasn't as original as we always thought? What if Lovecraft borrowed inspiration from something far more tangible than any of us ever hoped to admit? What if the Eldritch beings captured in the pages of H.P. Lovecraft's work were more than nightmare-fueled fiction? What if these things were real? They found his lifeless body face down in a ravine. Okay, pause. Now, I get that we're a cryptid show, but man, that opening line there feels as true crime as it gets. So if gore isn't your thing, hop a chapter marker ahead for me. Okay, let's try that again. They found his lifeless body face down in a ravine. Bill Gifferson, a local to Middletown, Maryland, typically took the same route home every single day. Nothing unusual, just your standard walk about the countryside, heading back home after a hard day's work. But that was all about to change. Witnesses rushed into town to inform the authorities and press alike. Something massive had swooped down from the hillside above, blocking out the sun with its 14-foot wingspan, snatched a man up by the shoulders, and effortlessly hauled him back up to the top of the hill. Flashes of red began to shimmer in the sun as blood poured out in puddles around the mysterious monster. Some people ran. Some people turned away, sick to their stomachs, while others stood watching, frozen in horror as the echoes of Bill's screams mixed with the tearing of flesh reverberated across the countryside. The police thought the talk crazy, but with the press already en route to the scene, they quickly had to follow suit. As they drew near to the hillside, they were swarmed by a group of passersby who quickly filled them in on the rest of the gruesome details. It had a razor-sharp beak. It whipped its head sideways and slashed the man's jugular clean through, one witness recounted. Another chimed in, yeah, and as the man started gushing blood, it looked like some kind of tentacles came out of its beak and started drinking the blood from where it cut him. Police and press alike began making their way up to the now barren hillside. well, almost barren. Just shy of the hill's crest, they all made out the gory crime scene. A puddle and splatter of red, broken earth from where the claws of something struggling to hold back its prey, and a trail of red-dipped splatters leading down the backside of the hill and off the edge into the crag below, as if something had carried the body away. Slowly, rescue officers followed the trail of blood down into the ravine, where at the bottom, lifeless and mangled, they found him. It was just as the witnesses had described. Bill Giferson lay there covered in crimson, neck gashed open, and seemingly drained dry of what blood would have been left. As you'd imagine, word spread quickly. It's not every day someone is attacked by a monster, much less one as terrifying as this. And as February of 1909 dragged into March, so too did the sightings. Encounters with what locals were calling the Snallygaster were seeping in from every crack of society. The beast had been seen soaring across the sky over the town, crawling amidst the hills, and creeping through moonlit farms. Numerous farmers began reporting encounters with a creature seen feeding on cattle in the same tradition as it fed on our good buddy Bill, before flying off into the night. Witnesses described the Snallygaster as a massive, part bird, part reptilian beast with huge wings, metal talons that resembled steel hooks, and one single eye right in the center of its head. It had a long, pointed, razor-sharp beak that was lined with rows of razor-sharp teeth, and if that depiction isn't scary enough, it was said that when the Snallygaster opened its teeth-lined beak, it would uncurl a set of long tentacles from out of its throat that it would then wrap around its victim's wounds and begin to use the suction cups along those tentacles to drain its victims dry of blood. It would then look up into the sky and roar a bellowing screech that sounded reminiscent of a train whistle of the time. And side note, this is where watching the videos of this show really pay off because, well, artistic depictions of this thing are just as terrifying as it sounds. So, obviously, people were scared. The media was on alert. Oh, and current President Theodore Roosevelt, he was excited. An avid hunter, President Roosevelt had planned on canceling an upcoming African safari to instead go and hunt the Snallygaster, but ultimately ended up keeping his original plans due to sightings all but fizzling out by the end of summer that same year. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The final 1909 sightings of the Snallygaster happened in July, when a team of scientific researchers were attempting to find the creature's lair, and in part, no doubt, to secure that large financial reward the Smithsonian Institute had offered to anyone who could bring back a hide from one of these things. Local newspaper, the Valley Register, later reported that the scientific researchers, upon stumbling across a large cave, saw a massive winged beast matching the descriptions of the Snallygaster quickly take to the air and soar off toward the hills of Virginia. And just like that, as quick as the Snallygaster came, it was gone, leaving behind a season of tragedy and fear in its wake. Things slowly settled back into their normal pace, and the creature was forgotten to time. But if you've ever seen a good horror flick, you already know that just like Freddy Krueger, It, or Jeepers Creepers, a good monster is never truly gone, only resting until they slip back into the realm of folklore, patiently awaiting the arrival of a new generation to begin feasting upon their fears once again. 23 years passed with nothing but hearsay and whispers of tales from those past encounters. Fear had turned to curiosity, had turned to forgotten events, and Middletown Valley had gone back to normal. But an entire town can only bury their head in the sand for so long. Charles typically took the same route every single day. Nothing unusual, just your standard drive about the countryside, heading back into town. Does this sound familiar? It was a chilly November morning when Charles Main, a local ice cream shop owner, along with his friend Edward Leiter, were on their way back to Middletown from Frederick. But that Tuesday, as they traveled along just east of Braddock Heights, they saw something approach fast just ahead. The beast appeared suddenly from the south, Charles told reporters from the Cumberland Evening Times. Flying about 25 feet in the air, it made a sharp turn in the sky and began flying right towards us, before changing directions again just before reaching us and flying off. Both men gave descriptions of a monster with a massive wingspan, easily wider than 12 foot, and as they went on to describe it, it had all the same characteristic descriptions of the Snallygaster. The claws, the beak, the teeth, and even the tentacles that the men said seemed to be cast out like long streamers and then drew back in. But strangely enough, this time, the Snallygaster had an entirely new trick up its tentacle-filled sleeve. It changed colors. Charles stated that when he first saw the creature, it was white, but as it swiftly approached them, it changed and morphed to black. Now, many called his story ridiculous. Leslie N. Colbant's local attorney and president of the Frederick Board of Education went on record to openly rebuke Maine and Leiter's tale, calling it, and I quote, a bunch of hooey. But their account wasn't the last. Two boys, Junior Fulmer and Buddy Haupt, were out playing in the Middletown Commons when they witnessed a strange creature flying in from the South Mountain. They quickly ran home to tell their parents and pass along what they had witnessed as well. Local papers mention how many local African-American cornhuskers witnessed the Snallygaster early in the morning hours, going as far as to create the term Snallygasted to describe those who had seen it overhead. And as a brief side note, I'm glossing over a lot to this story, but we're coming back to this point in a bit because there's a lot to unpack about this little sentence, so just tuck this section away for now and bear with me. Thanks. Now, over the next half a year, Snallygaster sightings kept right on a-coming. The Montgomery County Sentinel that December stated how 20, or 40 people for the rest of us, had witnessed the Snallygaster in the last month alone. It goes on to report that 10 men armed with rifles and snoozeberries, which sound like something straight out of a Pokemon game, mind you, approached a cave in the mountains to hunt the creature, but it had retreated too far back into the cave system for them to safely hunt it. Later, an article was released detailing how scientists believe that Snallygasters laid eggs that should take on average 20 to 25 years to hatch, so this current Snallygaster must be an offspring of the previous one back in 1909. And then there were the sightings of the baby Snallygaster, which led people to believe more of these things were hatching. But according to Harry Watchell at least, this was just a bunch of paranoia. There was no baby Snallygaster. He knew this for certain because he had one in his possession. We briefly interrupt this program to fill you in on another spooky project you've been a part of since the beginning, even if you haven't been aware of it. Now, do you love spooky music? You ever find yourself fancying those background tunes on every one of our episodes? Then, well, we have a surprise for you. All of our music here on Cryptids Across the Atlas is produced by the very talented Braille Atlas, which just so happens to be me. I'm Braille Atlas. And in honor of spooky season fastly falling upon us, we are releasing 15 tracks that are exclusively written for this very show on all your major streaming platforms, including Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon, and more. So head over to thecryptidatlas.com/music to get notified when these spooky tunes are about to drop. There will be 3 EPs. Between the Shadows is all of our creepy piano songs, including our main theme, Intertwined, you hear in the background right now. The next is titled Below the Depths, and it has all that video game water level sea monster nostalgia you could ever hope for. And finally, Upon the Earth pulls on those terrestrial strings to give you a sense of that backwoods cryptid charm. I do hope you will check them out and enjoy them this spooky season and for many spooky seasons to come. Once again, that's thecryptidatlas.com/music, or grab the link from the show notes below. And now, back to our regular programming. Harry Watchell watched as people from across the valley poured in to see his baby Snallygaster in the flesh. Its wings were haunting with a mix of gray and white, its talons razor sharp and eyes wide. Its wings were impressive even for a baby, at 3 foot wide tip to tip. Harry managed to capture the beast with a well-placed bullet to the wing as he watched the monster soar overhead. When it spiraled to the ground, he grabbed it and caged it for the world to see. Except what Harry caught wasn't a Snallygaster. It was an owl. It's always an owl. Now, to his credit, it was a big owl, but it was just an owl. Now, of course, Harry knew this. He wasn't trying to pass this off as something more than it was. He was simply trying to calm the people. There was no baby Snallygaster. He had proof. It was just a big, kind of creepy owl who nestled up a bit too close to society for everyone's comfort. But what about the big Snally? Can I call it a Snally? I think I can call it a Snally. Where was Mama Snally hiding out, and how long would her reign of tentacle terror last? Luckily, it seems that question was about to be answered as well. Not far over the South Mountain, the supposed home of old Snally herself, lies a little place called Frog Hollow. And there in Frog Hollow, hidden away from prying eyes, was a rather large 2,500-gallon moonshine distillery. You see, moonshine was a big business, especially in 1933, the last leg of Prohibition. And it seems, like many Americans of the time, the Snallygaster couldn't keep its mouth parts off the bottle. The report states that as the Snallygaster flew over the distillery, it was overcome by the fumes. It spiraled uncontrollably out of the sky and plummeted directly into the steaming hot vat of alcohol. 5 men supposedly witnessed the beast crashing down, but none of their names were given, due to them all leaving the state, crossing the Potomac into West Virginia, out of fear of the creature, and not because they were running an illegal moonshine business, I'm sure. That following day, George T. Danforth, chief of Hagerstown Prohibition Office, along with Agent Charles E. Cushwa, the man who received the, hot tip, made their way to investigate both the distillery and the monster. Upon arriving that Thursday morning, they were shocked to learn that all of the operators who had gave the anonymous tip were nowhere to be found. Go figure. But what shocked them the most was when they peered off into that vat of moonshine and found nothing but the skeleton of some large winged monster floating about, flesh mostly gone, eaten up by the hot alcohol. Snallygaster, a mispronunciation of the words Schnellergeist, meaning quick ghost in German. In the early 1700s, this term would have been used by German settlers for things that caused more a haunting type of encounter. Got a wild wind blowing about? Schnellergeist. Creaky floorboards? Schnellergeist. Mysterious being lurking about in the shadows? You guessed it, Schnellergeist. So when a Lovecraftian Eldritch horror starts causing a ruckus in your town, well, Schneller my Geist if I do say so myself. But the more you read into these stories, I mean, let's get honest. There are obvious external forces at play here. And no, this time I don't mean Schnellergeist. Now remember that bit I told you we'd come back to earlier? The one about African Americans getting snallygasted? I think it's time we address the elephant and donkey in the room on this. And that's a political joke for those not in the USA. The Snallygaster is a lot of hearsay and verbal folklore. The story has grown from age to age. Grandparents love to tell their grandkids how if they don't behave, the Snallygaster's gonna get ya. But other than stories, there's really not much to go on here. If you want to boil it down to its bones, not unlike how the Snallygaster died, I guess, I digress, then the Snallygaster stories were pretty much all one of 3 things: folklore fun, financial and political gain, or racism. Papers at the time were neck deep in yellow journalism, a term you might have heard on here before, that basically means stuff they make up to sell more papers. Just a month prior in New Jersey, papers were running a story about a bizarre footprint that showed up, leading to mass interest in the Jersey Devil of the Pine Barrens, a cryptid that, if you're into cryptids, you probably know about at least a little bit. Now, George Roderick, son of the owner of the newspaper The Valley Register, which you've heard some of already, saw a story in some local competition about some supposed Jersey Devil and noticed the story started to make its rounds. He went above and beyond to drum up some local lore of his own. And what better than Schnellergeist? And well, it kind of worked. Article after article began to go into even more elaborate stories of the Snallygaster sightings and tales. Some of these stories even began to portray the Snallygaster as some kind of Civil War reincarnate being, where supposedly, after the creature landed and drank an entire 100-gallon cattle trough of water, exclaimed, in perfect English mind you, "My, I'm dry. I haven't had a good drink since I was killed in the Battle of Chickamauga." But as the papers sold more, so did the story adapt and grow. It soon wasn't enough just to sell papers. No, the Snallygaster was about to take on a new life in politics and population control. Here at Cryptids Across the Atlas, our mission is to make history fun through the lens of cryptids. We love to present the juxtaposition of what might lurk out in the shadows, while simultaneously bringing history and culture to light. But when you start flipping over rocks, sometimes something far more scary crawls out than some winged creature with a cyclops eye and a tentacle mouth. On February 12, 1909, the Valley Register published an article titled, "The Colored People Are in Great Danger." This article goes into great detail about how African American men were the prime food source for the Snallygaster, especially if they were out after dark. And it wasn't just men. Apparently, women of color were the next up preferred food source on the Snallygaster's list. And I'm sure it's just complete coincidence that this article came out the exact same day the NAACP, or National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was formally established. Later articles go on to detail how the Snallygaster comes around every election cycle to, well, eat all the African Americans who cast their ballot for a Democrat. And no, we don't get involved in politics here. This is verbatim what the paper said. Other articles claim that the Snallygaster came over as a result of African slave trade, and so it eats what it's used to eating. Once again, not my words. So, there you have it. The Snallygaster was obviously a tool for promoting racism, at least for a segment of its existence. Weaponized superstition was but one of the many tactics used to strip the black population of their freedoms. By placing fears upon a group of people that after certain hours or by voting certain ways they would be hunted by a monster was a way to keep the population well within the control of white racists who couldn't stand to see someone of a different color have, God help us, equal rights. Equal rights that wouldn't come for another 55 or so years, mind you. But while this was by far the worst, it wasn't the only politically motivated moment in Snallygaster folklore. Even when the tales of the Snallygaster cropped back up 23 years later, there was of course a motive to the madness. Think it's a coincidence that the Snallygaster died in a vat of moonshine months before Prohibition was lifted? Or was it perhaps more so a tool to promote an ideology, a way of reaching the people and implanting a set of ideas in their minds? After all, ideological and political gain has kind of been the Snallygaster's bread and butter for decades at that point. One of the final stories sums this up the best. A supposed photo of the Snallygaster riding away on, and I kid you not, a bicycle, was published stating that the creature was spotted riding through DC before flying off into the sunset, screaming in that signature train whistle scream, "Balance the budget!" Supposedly, the monster was going to make a grand reappearance on December 5th, which just so happened to be the same day the 18th Amendment prohibiting alcohol was set to be overridden. And this photo that was supposedly taken of the creature, yeah, the image was said to have been recovered by a photographer who noticed it burned into the retina of a politician. A politician that dropped dead right there on the scene as he heard the Snallygaster's menacing promise to return. At 23 years every cycle, and if you do the math, the Snallygaster is poised to return in 2024, which just so happens to be the year we're recording this in. And it seems to crop up toward the end of said year. So if you watch this before the end of 2024, keep your eyes open. You may just see something wild flying across Maryland's southern mountain. And if you watch this after, let's have a chat in the comments and see if 23 years is an accurate representation of when the Snallygaster makes its rounds. And let's just hope that this time when it comes back, we can lay down the political and racist banter and come together to enjoy a piece of folklore that reminds us of our history, of the progress hopefully we are striving to make as a society, and brings us together around the idea of cryptids. Because after all, behind every bit of folklore is a bunch of folks. And though that history may not always be so beautiful, it always offers us a chance to learn, to grow, and to explore a little more of the unknown. If you love cryptids and want to learn even more about the creatures we just talked about, find us on TikTok or Instagram. Just search username @TheCryptidAtlas. By the way, the episode you just witnessed is both a podcast and YouTube video, so whichever format you prefer, we have you covered. Also, check out our interactive cryptid map to browse the globe and learn about cryptids from your favorite areas. Every single episode we make adds another pin to our map. You can find our social channels, the map, and more at thecryptidatlas.com. And when you find us, be sure to tap that follow button and get in on the action by dropping a comment on our recent videos. If you enjoy this show, consider sharing it on with a friend. And if you listen on Apple or Spotify, consider leaving an honest review to help other listeners know what to expect. Thanks for touring cryptids across the Atlas. Until next time, keep your eyes open. You never know what you might see just on the edge of the road.